Hello and welcome to the fourth of the uh, Global Dialogues webinars leading up to the next Global Dialogues in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. Today I'm with Ranjit Hoskote, Distinguished Global Fellow, essayist, poet, art critic. Um, I've actually known Ranjit for a very long time. I realized the other day, 3 decades, more than 3 decades now. And I first met him when he was working for the Times of India in Bombay. I refuse to call it Mumbai. And so I've sort of, in a way, our careers have proceeded in parallel, and in different locations, different settings, shared preoccupations, many of them. But Ranjit, I've never actually spoken to you because we've never had this kind of formal conversation about your formative influences. Of course, I've read about them in the essays you've written, your introductions to your translations. There have been hints here and there, but I'm very curious because you also have a wonderfully sort of mixed background, a perfect kind of embodiment of Indian pluralist traditions. So can you tell us a little bit about your childhood, where you were born? I mean, I know tiresomely basic questions, but I hope you don't mind my asking them.
No, not at all. Pankaj, it's really it's a very special pleasure to be in conversation with you because, as you said, we've really known each other for 3 decades. We've followed each other's work, have had the same concerns, and belong to what seems to me to be increasingly an embattled generation. At least partly, I think, because the values that we simply took to be normal to us and certain ways of looking at the world are now the exception, it seems to me. So, and I think for me, a lot of that was very strongly rooted in my childhood. I was born in Bombay, and then when I was one, my parents moved to Goa for a few years, and then we came back. But to me, it was that early childhood in Goa, which was extremely formative, I would think. I didn't particularly realize this until a little later in life, how important those years had been. It was the 1970s. The Portuguese had been gone barely a decade. So
Wow.
it was actually the experience of growing up in an Indo-Iberian society with
Wow.
civilities, a way of understanding public life, the public sphere, intellectual exchange that was really quite European in a certain way, but inflected, as it were,
Mm.
for the tropics. So, and it was multilingual. It was enormously multilingual. And my own family, as you said, is multilingual for all kinds of historical reasons. So, particularly as a poet and a translator, when I think
Oh,
back,
sorry, Ranjit, where was your parents? Where were they from?
oh, we belong to this. I insist on calling it an ethnic micro-minority because we're diasporic. We are Saraswat province. So historically, this is a group that migrated from Kashmir to the West Coast and has had centuries of adaptation to where they found themselves and yet holding on to certain, if you will, core religious and cultural preoccupations.
Right.
So, which again is the reason why I was never happy with uh, fairly recent notions of identity by language, by region, because it seemed to me that my inheritance spoke of belonging to multiple regions, uh, being alive to many languages. And in a way, I think that's inoculated me, and it inoculated me very early against the kind of viruses that have now become dominant, uh, extremely parochialist, xenophobic forms of identifying oneself. So I think the embracing of the other was, in some sense, always part of this way of being, the inheritance, and how and where I grew up.
How long were you in Goa then?
About 5 years, six
5
years.
years.
Yeah, yeah.
I was also, apart from all the things you mentioned, it was also a rural idyll, I
It really
imagine.
was. It was extraordinary how there was a very strong civic culture in
Mm.
Margao, in Panjim, but it was really idyllic. It was sylvan. The mines were the big industry, but otherwise, by and large, you were, in the midst of nature, and we certainly were. The house was on the hill. It was completely wooded. So those early experiences of nature, again, I see have really been a basis for a lot of the environmental concerns that have become important to me over the last 15 or 20 years.
And it's interesting now that you mentioned, I mean, I think the imprint of Iberian imperialism in some ways was really quite deep. I've actually just returned from Brazil
Right.
and had occasion there to ponder, the sort of differences between the kind of colonialism we witness in Bombay, as distinct from Goa, just a few hundred miles south, are completely different cultures. So that's really fascinating that you were able and you were exposed to very early on to these very strong influences on modern India.
Yes, which also, as these things work, it unfolded itself to me much, much later. And I suddenly realized that I'd found myself in this empirical, experiential way in a society that had had its moment of reform before British India, through the Pombalian reforms, for instance, which had also been part of a republic before India achieved independence, short-lived, the Portuguese Republic. Then, of course, years of Salazarist dictatorship. But these impulses towards a liberal public sphere, towards free and fearless exchange, towards Republican representation, kind of a democratic way of life, these were very, very strong in Goa. Also
Mhm.
through institutions like the Comunidad, the this now is more romantic than real, but at the time I was growing up, it was definitely a real experience. The sense of the neighborhood, the community. And despite some historical tensions between religious groups, there was a great deal of confluentiality, shared customs, shared uh, sacred spaces, for instance.
Wonderful. So what were the schools that you were going to? What kind of schools? Were these Jesuit run in Goa?
No, actually, in Goa, it was an extremely intriguing. It was a new school founded by an architect called Sarto Almeida, one of our early and slightly unsung modernists who had also worked in East Africa. So Sarto and his wife Therese Almeida was an educationist. They, together with a set of liberal-minded citizens, among whom were some of the key industrialists in South Goa, they founded a school called Manovikas,
Wow.
which, despite the Sanskritic name, was actually founded in principles of pedagogy that really ultimately came out of Ivan Illich and Paulo Freire.
Paulo.
Yeah,
Wow.
very
Interesting.
much. So
Yeah.
it was a school that emphasized creativity and experiment and discovery, questioning, all of which did not stand me in very good stead when we went back to Bombay. And I went to a school that was still, for all practical purposes, in the colonial era, Bombay Scottish,
Gosh, yeah.
completely different kind of school. So, but when I look back, I think it was really Manovikas and Margao that was the cradle for many of these things, and was much
Right.
better aligned with my parents' own way of looking at the world, which
And
was
when did your habit of extracurricular reading begin? In obviously
uh,
you were too young in Goa, but you were still obviously, yeah, exposed to.
at home, really. This notion of curricular reading had actually very little meaning for me ever during my whole educational journey. It was largely things that were at home. My parents had a library, they encouraged reading. Both schools, Manovikas and Bombay Scottish, had wonderful libraries. So reading was always a way of expanding the world for me. It was a way of imaginatively embracing various other kinds of situations, times and places, and ways of thinking, I think. Also, I was born relatively late in my parents' marriage.
Oh,
So by the time I came along, they were past the moment when I think children are seen as infants. So fairly early on, they put A.L. Basham's Wonder That Was India in my hand and said, well, read this and this will tell you about our country. So, which I duly did. Again, as these things revealed themselves years and years later, I realized that that was actually one of the best things I could have read at the time because Basham was a Dravidianist. So unlike many books on ancient India, the Wonder That Was India actually has a very strong emphasis on the South. And I would not have got that from my curriculum at school, really. Again, you look back and in retrospect, these blessings reveal themselves. And another book that my parents introduced me to very early on, and which I've somehow never cited when I think about my intellectual influences. You know, one thinks of Gramsci and Levinas and Wittgenstein, who all came along later. It was Nehru. It was the glimpses of world history.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think it was just the engaging tonality, the epistolary nature of the writing. Again, discovering and sharing. It's an extraordinary book, and I don't think we value it enough.
Especially given that it was written, wasn't it written in a prison without
Yes,
any access to
very
any kind
little
of
access. Yeah,
library or archive? Uh,
absolutely.
really
Absolutely.
out of his reading, out of
Yeah,
his very
yeah,
prodigious memory.
exactly.
What are the books? I'm curious, what are the books were there in your parents' library? I mean, what were they? Uh,
Poetry in multiple languages. There was
really
father's taste was more classical, so he had anthologies like Palgrave, for instance. Or there was Wordsworth. There was but Tennyson. But the poem that he always recurred to and which stayed with me forever was The Ancient Mariner. So Coleridge was who he responded to very much. And my mother had studied literature and philosophy. So Keats was one of her favorites, but she also read in other languages and recited. It was more of an oral tradition. So Ghalib was with me very early on. Not that I understood a word at the time. It's highly Persianate, but it was the cadence, the musicality, the mystery of it. So these were some of the books that surrounded me, and also the epics across cultures. That was present. And I would describe them now as pluralists. They actually quite self-consciously describe
you
themselves as
had
Anglophone.
the Ramayana and Mahabharata
The
in
Ramayana, the Mahabharata in translation.
which editions were these? Were these
The ones that,
the
as a child, that I got were Rajagopalachari. And there were
interesting?
other editions there. But the Rajagopalachari editions, the retellings, I think, were really uh, vivid, somewhat old-fashioned, we realize, the prose, but still compelling in many ways. And as I now remember, I have to revisit the books. They weren't particularly bowdlerized. He didn't really steer away from difficult moral or sexual questions, for instance. So there was all of that, but also books on Greek mythology and Norse mythology, a whole range of different things.
Mhm.
So poetry, mythology, um, history, archaeology, these were strong preoccupations.
Interesting. And then Christianity or the Christian tradition you were exposed to at school.
Well, no, the school was secular, but it was around Margao was the heart of Catholic South Goa.
Oh,
But
yes.
also through my father had gone to a Jesuit boarding school, so he always felt much closer to the Christian tradition in some ways. So a lot of this was also out of storytelling. I mean, Jonah, who becomes an important character for me in my poetry much later. I mean, I first heard of Jonah, frankly, from a story that my parents told me, uh,
Interesting.
with much
Yeah.
embellishment, as I realized, because the book of Jonah is rather frugal in detail, but in
Yeah.
these tellings, it was much more dramatic.
Yeah. I remember when I met you, Ranjit, the first time, you seemed to me part of a flourishing literary community in Bombay. A fact of some sort of, a source of some envy for those of us in other parts of India who thought of Bombay primarily as a, place for businessmen, and for financial capital.
Right.
And yet there was this remarkable tradition there, flourishing at least since the days of Nissim Ezekiel,
Yes.
of poets and critics who knew each other, who read each other's works. How did you enter that particular community?
Uh,
What took you to it?
I have to say this too has something to do with family. It was actually my father who took me to Nissim Ezekiel when I was about 15 or 16. Uh, because
For those of us
Nissim,
who actually don't know who he is, can you just very quickly describe him?
Nissim
Really
Ezekiel
figure.
was really a seminal figure, I think, a very early Anglophone modernist poet, also an art critic who made some seminal and I think now overlooked contributions, and also pretty much single-handedly nourished a literary culture in Bombay. So this would be Nissim. So there I was with my early sheaf of poems. And Nissim was very kind, and I mean, told me right away that I shouldn't expect to be seen as a prodigy or a genius, which I said was totally fine with me. And then he was very, very uh, caring, not in this kind of, holding hands around the fire and singing Kumbaya kind of way, which many people now assume mentorship to be. But whether it was Nissim or Dom Moraes in his own way, or Keki Darawala, a number of poets in that generation uh, were actually very generous, I have to say, with their insights, with suggestions, with doors they opened in different ways. Tough, but also generous in their own ways.
So you were writing poems, but you were also developing an interest in art, in modern Indian
That's right.
painting.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Art, again, that was the other thing that was very strongly present at home. There were music and the visual arts. And again, once we were back in Bombay, my parents had this ritual of every other weekend taking me to South Bombay, which is where frankly, there were just about two galleries at the time, two private galleries and a public gallery. The Kemold and the Pandol were the private galleries, and the Jahangir Art Gallery, founded in 1952. Another extraordinary place was a public gallery where all the great artists used to show. So I remember going to the Jahangir at 13 or 14, and there was a work by Wolfgang Leib, the German artist who lives and works between Germany and South India, for instance. Early works by Jahangir Sabharwala, Vivan Sundaram, these were all just available. Again, it's the kind of blessing you look back to and realize it was a blessing, that this was really part of civic culture for those who wanted to participate in it.
And when did you formally pursue art criticism, or was this just again, when did you first start writing it,
I
for instance?
grew into it. I used to paint through school
Really?
and so on, and there was the usual round of the art competitions, which you probably remember from your own school years,
Oh,
and
yeah.
which is when I began to tire of this business of painting. So I went away from it a little, but continued to think about and be inspired by the visual arts. Also, because there's something about the visual image that both resists and invites interpretation in a way. So I think very early on, I was fascinated by that process.
Mhm.
And again, it began in the most tangential kind of way. I wrote something when I was in college, I wrote a small text on Vivan Sundaram's exhibition, Long Night, which was largely charcoal works. It was after a visit to Auschwitz, and I felt deeply moved. So I wrote this text, and my friend Girish Shahane said, "Can I show this to my mother?" And his mother was Shanta Gokhale, the
Oh, wow.
writer, the editor, and Shanta had just taken over as arts editor at the Times of India.
I've just got a book actually. I want to read it. Yeah.
Oh, her memoir.
My memoir. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So the Shanta read it, and she was building a whole new team for this new arts page and wanted to entrust young people with this vast responsibility. And so she asked me if I'd stay on and write, which I duly did. So it was really an interesting, almost it was a highly unusual team of people. We were all very young. Some of us were still in college. Some had barely finished. So there was Arundhati Subramaniam writing on dance, Himanshu Bote writing on architecture. There was me writing on the visual arts. It was an extraordinarily lively crucible again, and set within this larger context of Bombay cultural life that you talked about. It was not divided into silos of professional focus. There were architects and musicians and poets and theater makers, filmmakers. You would find them all as part of the same circle, largely.
Were there also professors or teachers that you encountered at college who you would include in this group? People who were, I mean, I suppose crucial in the making of this generation.
But they were not in the obvious places you might think of. I mean, for
Interesting.
instance, in my years at Elphinstone College, the faculty, the members of the faculty that I thought were most inspiring were actually in disciplines that I wasn't formally a student of. The Gujarati department, for instance, was headed by Geeta Ben Naik, who was a writer herself. And she and her husband Bharat had just started a journal devoted to a literary journal, Gadya Parva. And Gadya Parva was a focus for writers and visual artists. So at a Gadya Parva gathering, you would have a very young Atul Dodia, you would have a Bhupen Kakkar, you'd also have a Ghulam Sheikh, you would have Sitanshu, Yashash Chandra, Kamal Vora, Dilip Javeri, Prabodh Parekh. So again, I mean, I'm rattling off these names, but you'll recognize them as among the great and the glorious in the world of Gujarati arts and letters. So that was an extraordinary door opening up for a student. I'd also think of the Marathi department, again, not a department that I had any formal connection to, but all the three members of that department were acclaimed writers. So that, and I went on to translate pretty early the work of one of them,
Who's that?
Vasant Abaji Dahake.
Okay.
So his book Yoga Bhrashta, The Violated Sacrifice, which owes a great deal to the beat energies of the 60s. It was first published in 1972. So the crucial learning for me from these encounters and experiences was that it was a big mistake, which many people were guilty of, to think that it was the Anglophone writer who was the bearer of the modern and the radical. In fact, it became very clear to me that it was the Gujarati, the Marathi, the Hindi, the Urdu writers who were in many ways more committed to and more the product of these transcultural processes. So you have a Marathi writer in Aurangabad who's reading Kerouac and reading Ginsberg, for instance.
Actually, now that you mentioned it, I'm reminded of just how profound the influence of the Beats was on Indian literature in Indian languages.
Yes,
Something still little written about.
that's right.
But I think also, I suppose, because of their presence in some of these places in Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta,
Absolutely.
they went out and met many poets and writers.
Yes. Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, I think that influence is to be seen more vividly in Bengali or Marathi literature
very much.
than Indian.
In fact, I think there was almost a social resistance. There's that story that's part of Bombay folklore about Ginsberg and Corso landing up at Nissim's house.
Oh,
And,
yes. Yeah.
you know, was it Corso who goes out for a pee
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
on the lawn? And of course, the grand dames of Bombay who are assembled there are absolutely aghast and agitated. But these beat nut jobs had absolutely no problem with Arun Kolatkar and Ashok Shahane and Malay Roy Chaudhary and Shakti Chattopadhyay and Shunil Gangopadhyay. So really, I think in tracing these histories, we must commit ourselves to these multiple languages. This became clear to me. Also, the phenomenon of the multilingual reading, which happened a lot at Elphinstone College, set in motion precisely by some of these people that I mentioned. It again was a way of not taking on board India's multilingual reality just as some kind of external reality. It was to be immersed in it and through its most creative practitioners.
Ranjit, when you were becoming part of this sort of larger community that you're just describing, cosmopolitan, and probably unself-consciously cosmopolitan, I mean, I suppose the tensions there would have been between that kind of, for want of a better word, vernacular cosmopolitanism and the sort of Western version of it or the Anglo-Indian version of it. One tension there, the other tension between vernacular cosmopolitanism and the sort of vernacular nationalisms then emerging across India. And actually, let's not forget, very prominently in Mumbai from the 1970s onwards.
Of course.
With the Shiv Sena. To what extent were you aware of these tendencies, in let's say in the 80s or 90s?
Oh, very, very aware of them. I think it was clear that we were really at this point of having to decide who we were, and which is why part of this Bombay tension, that's very much a part of the story. But then you realize that it's not really an antagonism. It should be, if anything, an acceptance that the city is a kaleidoscope. And one way of thinking about it doesn't cancel out another. So for me, very early on, I think there was a sense that it had to be, and with my particular uh, preoccupations with belonging in multiple places and so on, I think it was clear that we had to adopt a cosmopolitan attitude, but one that was open to precisely these organic, if you will, from the bottom up, vernacular, robust cosmopolitanisms, and also what came from outside, if you will. In fact, as I use the term what came from outside, it seems very clear to me, and I'm glossing via Dipesh Chakravarti's idea of what does he say? Domesticating Europe.
That's right.
Provincializing Europe. What am I saying? Provincializing Europe. Although domesticating, I think, works even better in a way.
It's better. It's better, actually.
Part of your home.
Yeah.
So figures like A.K. Ramanujan, who would come by and speak to us at the Pen, for instance, or Aga Shahid Ali, or on the other hand, figures like Dahake or Dilip Chitre or Arun Kolatkar, all of these people seem to me and to many people in my generation to embody a way of doing this, of being very closely in touch with organic, if you will, homegrown cosmopolitanisms, and yet being part of global currents that had room for encounter with the so-called other. I mean, at all points, a tense, precarious work and process and progress. But I don't think that there was any other way of living in the Bombay of the 80s and the 90s, really. And we were very aware of the political violence. So whenever people describe Bombay as cosmopolitan, in my mind, I would always say, but there's also the counterpoint to that, which is a very parochial nativist Bombay. So navigating through that, I think, was an important rite of passage for many of us.
And when I met you in Bombay in the mid 90s, you were then writing a column for the Times of India, which was really, how would you describe that? It was, I mean, it seemed to me, maybe I'm misremembering it, but it was really largely about spiritual and religious matters.
Yes. For my sins, I was appointed the first religion and philosophy editor of the Times of India.
What,
And
yeah,
yeah,
unbelievable.
in
In
1996, I was,
retrospect, yeah.
yeah, absolutely unbelievable. And I thought to myself, I was just 27 at the time. But it was actually an experiment, if you will. And I called the column The Speaking Tree in honor of a book
Yes.
by a dear friend,
Richard
Richard Lanoy, exactly.
Yeah.
And in those early years, at least, it was meant to be a clearinghouse for perspectives from different religious traditions, from those who opposed
Who
religious
commissioned
traditions.
you, Ranjit? Sorry to interrupt.
No, literally, it was Samir Jain,
Oh,
the,
wow.
the vice chairman, the owner of the newspaper, who had his own deep investments in the spiritual life, but
Right.
also felt that to really offer a serious account of where he was coming from. I think he really felt that there were many things, many aspects of the imagination that found no place in the newspapers, which were largely given to the bleak, the depressing, and the catastrophic. So, but I think more pragmatically, he also saw that religion was playing a more and more weaponized role in the public sphere. And I think from his point of view, it is a question of figuring out how one could open up different ways of thinking about religion, spirituality, philosophy. And from my point of view, it was a great opportunity to bring together all of these different uh, uh, bearers and exponents of different perspectives. This has changed, I notice, over the years as the column has continued. But in those years, it was really meant to voice pluralism, to make room for dissent and discussion. And it worked rather well in those years. And it's now I see it's become part of the media landscape, although somewhat different in its emphasis now.
Yeah. And that language has been hijacked
It has.
too and distorted. But I mean, what was your sort of first major intervention then, both, artistic and literary? This was in the 90s, obviously.
It was. I think for me, the milestone would be my first book, which was 1991. It was called Zones of Assault.
Yeah.
But I think it came about at a point when not that many books were being published, particularly of poetry. You had the Three Crowns series that OUP had published through the 70s. There was the Disha series from Orient Longman, and there were a few others. There was the Valiant Writers Workshop always,
Bilal.
Bilal in Calcutta. But this was a new series for Rupa and Company that Nissim was the series editor for. So a number of us, Tabish Khair, who I'm doing a public conversation with tomorrow in Bombay, he was one of the poets. And I think back to that time as a time of beginnings, in a way, in terms of early books, in terms of friendships that have lasted for decades, platforms for discussion and dialogue. But in other ways, it was a fairly gradual process, really, of settling into the world of literature, of the arts, and one thing led to another. For instance, my work in curating really organically grew from my art criticism.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there came a point when I thought, maybe one can show rather than tell, in terms of an argument being made about where we stood. Was painting dead? Was abstraction to be abandoned? Was the installation the only way forward? After a lot of to and fro in seminars and symposia, I thought, well, let me maybe put together a couple of exhibitions and explore this. So it was that kind of scene. It was before professionalization. There were no programs in curatorial studies, not only in India, but really nowhere else either. Goldsmiths hadn't started their curatorial studies program
Oh,
yet.
really? Okay.
Yeah. So it was a very new domain. The figure of the independent curator wasn't that ancient either. It was really Harald Seemann in 1969 who declares himself to be an independent curator. So I think for me, the 90s were also a time of thinking about relationships with institutions, with galleries, with museums, with the academy. But perhaps we all went through that. I think, Pankaj, you yourself have always made a life as an independent writer, but working with,
Always
collaborating with
affiliated,
institutions.
absolutely
Yeah.
loosely or
Yes.
otherwise with institutions. When was a time? I mean, you're describing really a time of flourishing. The first book, and then this work. I wouldn't call it journalism, intellectual journalism for the Times of India. Art, criticism, curation, developing networks. When did you think that this particular life began to come under certain pressures it hadn't previously faced?
Right. I think, again, for our generation, I think the key moment of crisis and trauma was 1992.
Mm.
Was 6th December 1992, when the Babri Masjid was demolished by right-wing Hindutva militants. I think that's the point for many of us where we wondered whether everything that we had believed in was about to vanish. I mean, it took a number of decades to weaken and vanish. But at that point, I think we were very aware that this was where we had to take our stand. And it also became the point where we realized that this life of the mind couldn't proceed in a vacuum, and that there were powerful forces ranged against it. But really, I don't think it was until well into the 2000s that this whole way of being has become far more vulnerable, and appreciably so in the last 10 years, I think. Which coincides with technologies of surveillance, with forms of tyranny that are now well articulated and well placed to really to displace the constitutional order. And this is a global phenomenon.
I've been thinking a lot, Ranjit, lately about the relationship between literary, artistic communities and political power, especially political power in nation states that are still young, in the
Yeah.
process of formation, as it were. I've been reading a lot of Soviet writing
Right.
to understand. And there's, of course, also the sort of art component to it. Think of the number of Russian artists who were initially very welcoming of the
Yes.
revolution. Chagall famously,
Yes.
and Kandinsky, many others who thought this was
Yeah.
a great event.
Mayakovsky says.
Tchaikovsky, absolutely. Even, to a lesser extent, people like Pasternak.
Yes.
But then, of course, many difficulties developed with the arrival of brutal despotism and
Absolutely.
sort of increasing control. It's a different relationship, obviously, in the advanced, so-called advanced Western democracies, where the writer is, in a way, given a relatively comfortable place and relatively secluded place in the culture, even from the perspective of many other societies, somewhat pampered
Right.
by their society. And I've been thinking about India, what happened after independence. There was that moment where writers, even if they were not explicitly seen as part of a nation building project,
Yes.
they were certainly seen as people who were net contributors to it,
Yes.
in defining an idea of the nation or what it
Yes.
should be, and so on. But as you say, post 1992, there was a growing sense among lots of people that these artistic and intellectual communities are actually, to use their favorite word, parasites,
Yes.
and are people who have led us down the wrong path, that we should not have been reading Nehru, global world history.
Yes, indeed.
Um, we should have been reading, you know, who knows what we should have been reading, but certainly not these folks.
No, no, no.
Maybe we shouldn't have been reading at all.
At all, exactly. That's a cardinal sin there to read anything. You might actually figure out how to think. This would
Yeah,
be a crime.
yeah. How would you describe the sort of, kind of increasingly tormented relationship between, the literary, intellectual, artistic elite and now extensively, even if shallowly politicized populations, that really don't have much time for literature and art.
No, no.
In fact, maybe actively hostile to them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've actually had occasion to think about this also through conversations with architects, which is another part of my life. Deep interest in architecture and a commitment to it through exhibitions and writings and so on. But I've realized that both the writer and the architect were seen as participants in what you characterized as the nation building process. And today, you really can't use the word civilizational because that's been taken over by the right wing. But if you think back to architects like Habib Rahman or Charles Correa or Balkrishna Doshi on the one hand, or to writers like Kumar Narayan on the other, or Shivram Karant, the sense I have is of people who were not only participating in processes of equity and justice and representation, but they were also holding up and relaying into the present what they took to be valuable ideals of how to be together, how to share ideas, how to form a common language. I think these were all key questions. And today, all of that seems fragmented and episodic. And I've often thought back to this generation. I think of them as the generation of the Titans, and they really were in many ways, some of the people I just mentioned. But today you're in a situation where you're not even sure who your audience is. I used to valorize the unpredictable reader as someone uh, who you don't know, but your words reach. But today, that unpredictable reader seems to also be distanced from you in through many different discourses, many of which are antagonistic to the idea of reading or writing or thinking. So I think the key question today for me is something I wouldn't have asked 20 or 30 years ago. Who am I writing for? Or what are the solidarities one can rely on? I think in the old days, we could rely on somehow notions of community and solidarity that came out of longer processes. Today, a lot of that has been shattered. And how do you address? I'm 57. We're the same age, Pankaj.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's increasingly for me a question of thinking about now what might a younger generation of readers be thinking? What is their life world like? What could they, what are the assumptions that they build on? And that's when it comes to me, like that little anecdote we shared earlier about someone who came up to me after a particularly lively panel and said, "My goodness, it was so amazing. It's as if all of you had read the same books." And I thought to myself, that's perfectly normal for my generation, but perhaps not for digitally shaped generation. So I think it's this question of seeming unanchored as a writer.
Mm.
How closely connected are you to a readership? Then, of course, you're incredibly grateful for responses that come in, people who engage with your work. But in a way, perhaps it turns you in on a kind of solitude,
Mm.
which could also be productive. And what do you think, Pankaj? Are you
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm listening very carefully to your thoughts on this because I'm struggling with this myself. I think this question, you know, who do I write for? I mean, obviously in India, you always felt yourself part of a really tiny minority, much, much smaller than minorities, literary minorities elsewhere. So the sense of marginality there in India was often profounder. Um, Nevertheless, I think there was that sense. As I said, when I went to Bombay, I saw you as part of a larger literary community. It was real. It was real. We know many, many people in it, many people who came out of it, many people who continue to look up to it. But will there be such a community today? Is anyone out there mentoring writers and poets in the same way, or publishing them in the same with the same kind of energy and commitment as people like Adil or Nissim and many others
right?
did? Would there be even resources available
Right.
to people
Yeah,
like that today? Very, very tough
it-
questions. And then, of
it's
course, incredibly adverse political climate that is
absolutely. It is actively hostile.
hostile
But
to
that being said, Pankaj, at least for poetry, I find that it's a lot more horizontal. It's within the same generation, but there is a great deal of activity. There are independent publishers, some of them built around communities of writers and readers. There are festivals devoted to reading, and I wouldn't dismiss the phenomenon of the literary festival. I
mm,
think often it's like the biennial in the world of the visual arts. I mean, everyone announces the death or irrelevance of the biennial, and the next thing you know, there are five more of them. So having now, especially in the last few years, being fairly intensively committed to the literature festival circuit, I've been amazed at how many real readers there are out there, and across generations and across languages. So
mm,
it really doesn't, I don't think it's fair to the Lit Fest to see it only through the lens of some kind of largely imagined glamour. I think a lot of the everyday life of literature is spoken for in the average Indian Literature Festival. There's just such a sense of discovery of new writers, new ways of thinking, conversations. And I know that for a number of readers, as I remember from my own childhood or teenage years, you met someone you'd idolized or admired or read, and that sets you on a certain kind of journey.
mm.
So I think literature festivals, for instance, are a way of keeping these doors open.
I think I can confirm this from the perspective of someone who was actually violently hostile to literary festivals for the longest time and refused to go to them. So
Right.
it's only in the last couple of years that I've started going. And maybe I was too glamored by, the notion of the solitary writer who should be approached only through his or her works. And I also did have experiences of meeting famous writers who turned out to be terribly disappointing in the
That
flesh.
too. As Eunice D'Souza writes in one of her poems, best to meet in poems of a situation like this.
Yeah. But now that, I go to them, and of course, Georgetown Global Dialogues is not a literary festival in the
No.
real sense. Um, but nevertheless, it's an occasion for solidarity. It's an occasion for people from different parts of the world to come together and share their experiences and reflect on them more rigorously and resourcefully than they otherwise would sitting in their own rooms.
Absolutely.
Um, and so having now done that, I can absolutely see that communities of this kind, communities of reflection, communities of understanding are more important than ever.
Absolutely.
And I think, one can ignore all the sort of, I suppose, kitschy or vulgar aspects that
Yes.
attend some of these public exhibitions of literature or art. But nevertheless, I think for the artists themselves, they become a big spiritual resource, and
Absolutely.
place where they can kind of refresh themselves. And increasingly, the awareness of people who are responding to you, who are engaging with you and your ideas and your work, because that is something that really, in this digitalized world,
Yes.
is more elusive than ever.
Absolutely.
Um, so it's no, it's I think I'm a fanatical convert to the to the religion
Of the Literature Festival.
of the literary
Oh, my
festivals.
goodness. But also to be seen in conjunction with reading circles and so many of the other ways in which readers and writers come together. And then the
Yeah.
festival is like a crest out of that wave.
We're going, as you know, Ranjit, to Indonesia for the
Yes.
next chapter of this quite incredible journey, through a series of political earthquakes. Hopefully, Indonesia would offer a more, let's say, a calmer setting for our conversations
Yes.
than Europe and America. How would you, I mean, this is a part of the world that we are geographically very close to,
True.
but weirdly, intellectually quite remote.
Yes.
Um, is this a part of the world that you've been engaged with or interested in?
I've been fascinated by it from very early years, again, because of the Nehruvian context. It was, there was a legendary aura around in Indonesia, certainly because of the Bandung Conference. And that entire heroic way of thinking about how newly independent countries could be in a world that was overshadowed by superpower rivalry, how to think about Afro-Asian and Latin American unity, how to think of a third way forward, everything that we club under the banner of non-alignment. So that was certainly. So there was also the historical awareness of the connection to Southeast Asia. Uh, Later, I actually visited there. It's been a very long time. I haven't been there in about 25 years. This was part of a transnational project called Under Construction, which the Japan Foundation set in motion. So 6 or 7 of us young Asian curators were brought together, and we went to one another's countries. We uh, worked on projects in various places, and then everything went up to Tokyo. And this was a 2-year process, 2000 to 2002. So as part of that, actually went to Jakarta and Bandung and Jogja. So for me, it'll be a circling back after a long time. But I remember thinking of how very lively the visual arts context was there. There was a certain openness to ideas that came from elsewhere, but also a very organic preoccupation with crafts traditions from within. So I think for me, coming from this modernists versus others kind of debate in India, it was amazing to see people who had no trouble zigzagging between crafts traditions and whatever was on offer from that nascent phase of digital media, the installations, immersive um, environments, and so on. So I was very inspired by what I saw there. Also, the work of Harry Dono, for instance, comes to mind.
Mhm.
And but I must confess, it is a country that I should have attended to much more in terms of the writing that came out of very key political experiences, for instance, through the mid 60s that we're aware of, which became part of our narratives too. But I'm looking forward very much to this different point of vantage for us from which to look at
Mm.
the world.
Absolutely. As you were speaking, I was also thinking of the sort of very public installations there in streets, squares, and public buildings of figures from the Mahabharata,
Right.
uh, everywhere, which are, for the first time visitor, really striking. It's this sort of very frank acceptance of the country's pluralist heritage, even though
Very
it's the
much so.
second largest Muslim population in the world.
True.
Yet there is this, again, an unself-conscious acknowledgement that this is a country of many, many religions and
Exactly.
ethnicities
Yeah.
and loyalties.
Yeah.
It's not a majoritarian country in that respect.
No.
Um, and I think in my own sort of recent visits there, even though that pluralism has come under strain,
Yes.
obviously from the familiar folks, it's I think it's quite rooted, especially in a place like Java.
Yes.
The syncretic traditions are really incredibly rooted. So I hope they survive this very bleak phase.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it would be really interesting for us to be there and to be, I suppose, closer. We'll be very close to staying very close. I'm sure you've been there to Borobudur. Hope we'll be able to
It would be
go.
amazing to go there. No, I haven't actually been. I missed that
Oh,
on the
well,
last trip there.
there's a treat awaiting you.
Yes.
It's an extraordinary experience,
Looking forward
especially.
to if we can get there, that would be amazing.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's early in the morning. It's fantastic. One of the great sights in the world. And I think maybe being there would give a sort of sharper focus to many of our reflections on pluralism, the dangers to
Yes.
it,
Yes.
um, and how do we respond? Because so much of the arsenal that we have from modernity is pretty empty right now.
It is. It is.
I think one has to actually look to some of these other traditions.
Oh, absolutely. And as you were speaking, I was thinking very much of what Sheldon Pollock calls the Sanskrit cosmopolis.
Populace, yeah.
There's a line from the book on Sanskrit, the language of the gods and the world of men. Pollock talks of how there was a point when, as I remember, a grammarian in Java and a playwright in Ujjain would have understood each other perfectly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and all the way up to Peshawar, for instance. So I think these ideas of these great ecumenies, or these cosmopolitan schemes of circulation, I think these are vital. They're not just the subject of nostalgic romanticization. When you think of what I've been thinking of as the Iranosphere,
Yeah.
uh, that whole transnational swath where Persian was a key language, or the Sanskrit cosmopolis, or the ecumeny of Arabic. And Indonesia has all three of these. It's a confluence of all of these and what comes from within, in any case. So it really is an extraordinary template for cosmopolitan being.
Yeah, absolutely. Something one ought to emphasize more and more. I was in a conversation yesterday at the BBC where the fellow panelists were going on about spheres of influence, and it occurred to me that so much of our conversation is trapped by these really facile geopolitical categories.
Yes.
This part of the world should be governed by the United States, the other one by
Oh
China,
my
Russia,
God.
a kind of imperialistic thinking
Completely.
that is totally contemptuous of, actually mostly oblivious of all these other
Absolutely.
things that have happened in the past, which make these spheres of influence look like fantasies, really.
And I think they
They're
always
far more
were. Yeah.
interconnected,
Yeah.
you know, and culturally than any of these kind of geopolitical daydreams can seem.
No, and you're so right when you say that they're not just contemptuous, they're often oblivious of these complexities. There's a kind of a sovereign perspective. It's very much this Congress of Vienna kind of attitude, as if
Exactly.
it's still 1815 and you're looking at the map and drawing lines across it.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, this has been fantastic, Ranjit. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Likewise. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you
and
so much, Pankaj.
very
Really
much
enjoyed
look forward to seeing
being
you
in
soon.
this
Yeah,
conversation. Yes.
yeah,
See you in Java.
to resuming it. And thank you all for joining us today. Please check in again for the next conversation.